Welcome to our podcast. This is Friends on Fire.
I'm Mike. I'm a lifelong devotee of financial independence. I even wrote a book about it.
And I'm Maggie, a newer convert, but just as passionate, especially on the intersection of minimalism and financial independence.
We're one and the same.
We are two like-minded friends who believe that talking about money with your friends and family opens the door to financial well-being.
The Friends on Fire podcast is about dispelling myths, building financial acumen, and sharing your financial independence journey with the people you care about.
This is Friends on Fire. Hey, Maggie.
Hey, Mike.
How's it going?
It's going well. You know, I had a 2-hour nap today. That's the sort of things I dreamt about in early retirement. It was lovely. I didn't really plan on it. I had some other plans, but I just, I was a little tired. I had already ran and done a workout and taken the kids to school. And I was like, I'm like feeling a little sleepy. I'm going to go with this.
I'm very happy for you.
Yeah, it was great.
As a little piece of advice to all of our listeners, though, you don't need to retire in order to take naps during the day. You could also just take naps if you want.
How did you take a nap during the day when you had a job? I'm talking to myself, but you nap in the middle. You just like wait till someone emails you to wake you up. And then a very exciting thing that I just think is worth a shout out is, did you know this, Mike? There is a documentary that just dropped today on Netflix that is called Get Smart with Money.
Mm-hmm.
I'm only about 4 minutes into it, but it features the Budgetnista, Paula Pant, Mr. Money Mustache, a bunch of people in the FIRE community. And it looks like it's kind of a documentary of help those people, some influencers in the financial space, helping multiple families and single people through different like financial coaching scenarios. It's just pretty cool because there's there's a ton of cooking shows and food shows and like you don't see, and home organization and DIY and all this stuff. Like you don't see a lot of content around money.
Yeah, it's very not sexy, not made for TV.
It's super sexy to me. But I'm excited that I can't wait to watch. I'm probably going to go finish watching it tonight. I watched like 5 or 10 minutes of it before
that's exciting.
We're recording.
We're going mainstream.
Yeah. We as in like people in the community, not us, to be clear.
Yeah. We're not on Netflix.
We did not make it to the Netflix. Apparently it's been like in the works for 2 years. Oh, and the opening scene is Paula Pant on stage at FinCon last year. I recognized the sparkly dress she was wearing. And then they panned to the audience and I was like, what? Maybe I'm in this. And then I was like, no, it was just a few people in the audience for a second. And it wasn't me. Apparently I was sitting in the wrong seats. Had I known. Okay. I'm super excited for today's discussion.
I am mixed.
Because there's going to be a lot of feelings.
Yeah. It's a lot of talk about feelings.
Yeah. Well, ironically, it was your idea to go. I think maybe the anxiety topic was my idea or something, but then it was your idea to go ask people on Instagram like what their financial anxieties were. And I never know. We get like mixed response on different questions we do. Like today I asked people to name my sourdough starter on Instagram and I got a couple of really funny replies, by the way, like John Doe. And
That's
Dolores.
Yeah.
I like Dolores too. But I didn't get a lot of replies. When I asked people for their financial anxieties, oh my goodness, it was like an open therapy session of the replies we got.
It's almost as like we're a personal finance podcast and not a cooking podcast.
You're right. Actually, that's a great point. Maybe that's why when I ask financial questions, the engagement's so high.
Yeah.
When I ask people to name now I would argue my bread baking and me getting into sourdough bread making is actually financial related because the loaves of sourdough at Aldi right now are like $4.50.
Mm-hmm.
Do I look like I can afford that? No. Inflation has hit the bread market, the artisanal bread market. So,
but going back to your point about asking our listeners for input, I always think this is super interesting because we tend to, in some ways, live in like an echo chamber, and I think the whole FI community can be like this to some degree, but it's always good to get people's feedback, and it also helps us keep our topics relevant so that we're not just talking to ourselves. So I was just kidding. I am very excited about this episode. And in preparation for it, I gave some thought to what makes me anxious, Maggie.
What does make you anxious? Because you don't get anxious about a lot of things. Maybe spending money I think makes you anxious, actually.
I could only really come up with two things related to money that make me anxious. You ready for this?
Okay, yeah, no, I'm ready. I'm on pins and needles.
When I feel wronged in a situation, like if I am taken advantage of.
Like the ATM machine in Germany. I felt wronged by that machine, but keep going. Okay, when you feel wronged, so I get it.
If I make a mistake, I feel kind of stupid, but I don't feel wronged about it, and it doesn't make me anxious. I just feel silly. What I'm talking about is like when I sign up for some service and I have a cost in writing and I get charged something different, and then I have trouble reversing it, or I can't do something, and even though I know I'm in the right. If I'm being taken advantage of, that will bother me to no end. Even if it's $2, it will just eat at me for a long time. Makes me anxious.
Okay, what else?
The other thing is when I need to line up a whole bunch of things. So when I am going after some special deal or pieces need to fall into place, like there's limited availability for something and I need to buy something at a certain point, but I need to, and this is mostly with travel. So I need to buy tickets at a certain point, and then when I get there, I need to be able to get some certain time for something. Like that sort of the logistics and the possibility that things will fall apart if the pieces don't fall into place makes me very anxious because I can't control it.
Well, so thank you for sharing, Mike, and being vulnerable. By the way, I know people can't see you, but the way you were like, "You're welcome," like it really meant a lot. Like that was a big share for you.
I'm trying,
I get it.
Maggie. I wrote this down on my notepad so that I could share it with you.
I love it. I got another question though, because I feel like there's another financial anxiety in there. But as I was like saying it to myself, I was like, I don't know. So I feel like you are anxious about spending money and like splurging on things. But what I was maybe going to correct, and I'm curious for your thoughts, obviously, since I'm talking about you and you're here. It almost seems like maybe you're not anxious about that. You just don't need or want to spend money, which is different than being anxious about it.
I think this is a good opportunity to look up the definition of anxious. Characterized by extreme uneasiness of mind or brooding fear about some contingency. Second definition, characterized by, resulting from, or causing worrying.
Do you worry when you're on vacation and you spend a bunch of money on some overpriced food or drink or somewhere, and you're kind of like, you're there and you need to, and everybody's hungry? Like, does that stress you out? Do you worry about it? Or are you just like, oh, it's what it is?
Not particularly.
Okay.
I don't find myself in situations like that. Like I will knowingly go into a situation where like, I know I'm going to have to go buy dinner. I'm on vacation. I will have to buy dinner and it will be expensive. And I'm not too concerned about it.
Okay. And that's interesting.
I don't particularly like it, but I'm not anxious about it.
I think I've talked about this a little bit lately since my paycheck has stopped coming in, which for some reason they quit paying me when I left. I definitely have, I was joking about that sourdough bread for $4.50. Like it wasn't a joke with my point, but I have anxiety now about, even though I actually have the money in my budget, which we'll talk about, I have anxiety about spending money now, which I never had before. And I have a little bit more of a scarcity mindset, and I'm getting out of it. Like, that's why I was talking about the Seafire Sim tool. And like, I need to just be reminded of that I'm okay and that I can spend within this limit, and, everything else, and not stress so much about it. But it has created a level of anxiety that comes from spending money that I never had before when I had money coming in. Right. Which makes sense. It's very logical. Anyways. So my favorite response that we got, Mike, which I didn't write, but I could have said, because when you're putting this in Instagram, just for those that aren't familiar with Instagram, it's like a question box and you only have a certain number of characters. You can only write like a sentence or so. You can't write a paragraph or you have to like DM people. And someone wrote, my anxiety can't fit in this box. And because we were like, what are your financial anxieties? And, we'll tell you all the different things people told us. But I loved the response. And I'm not like making fun of that person. Like I can relate to that person. So I appreciated the humor and realness of the answer. It was my favorite answer of all of them. I think I directly replied to that person. It was like,
yeah, that's pretty good.
I love your response of my anxiety can't fit in this box. So let's talk about, we're going to get into, and we're going to like read, we've kind of categorized a lot of people's anxieties and we'll read off a lot of examples of them. But before we even get into that, we're going to like, as we talk through these, we're going to hit some of our thoughts and suggestions on these specific anxieties. But I think we should take a step back first and talk about an overall kind of holistic approach to cope with any of your anxieties, regardless of what they are, right? I think there's a few things that can help solve or mitigate or help you cope through the worrying and the overall anxiety that people have. And there are three things that I kind of personally felt like would really help. And again, like in a holistic way, and it's education, preparation, and community. And we can talk through all of these very briefly, all three of these very briefly. But I think, Mike, education is what we're doing on this podcast, right? It's learning about new things, right? When you're stressed about inflation, like learn about inflation, right? And understand how it works. And like the more you educate yourself on a topic, I think the more informed you are and the better you will be able to work through whatever your fears or anxieties are.
Yeah, because I think that once you learn about something, in many cases, you realize there's nothing to be afraid of. And I've talked about this before, but like, I don't really like flying. Turbulence makes me very anxious. It's not something I can control. It's just like a natural reaction to turbulence. It like scares me, And I think this is kind of common for people. But one thing that has helped is that I spent a good amount of time learning about turbulence and planes and how they work and statistics about how safe they are. And, when I hit a patch of turbulence, I will tell myself, planes don't have to fly straight. Plane has never crashed because of turbulence. Flying in a plane is the safest form of transportation. And it doesn't like eliminate the anxiety, but it certainly reduces it dramatically. And all of this financial stuff, if you learn how the stock market works, it's not that scary.
Yeah. And it allows you to cope, right? Like we talked about this and we did an episode 148, which was 8 ways to tackle your financial fears, which is if anxiety and fear is a big thing for you, I'd also really recommend you go listen to that episode. But we talk about in that episode that there's a good side to fear, right? Like it stops you from doing stupid things, right? And stops you from doing things that just don't make sense. And so, but it also helps you get, that education piece helps you get past and cope with it enough that you'll still get on a plane, Mike. Okay. So the second thing is preparation, which education is foundational to. You got to learn what you should be doing, but then you actually need to start doing some of those things, right? So you've, to take some of the examples of stuff we'll talk through today, if you don't really understand what a solo 401k is, which is, where I'm at right now, I've been learning about solo 401ks because I want to participate in one as a no longer being employed now and having having a real estate business and being able to do it as an entrepreneur. And so I'm learning about it, but I also need to actually prepare. There's some things I need to do to like open an account, I want to consult with an accountant about a couple of things. There's some actual preparation I need to do. So it's not just learning. The first step is learning and listening and being a sponge and absorbing everything you can. And then the next step is actually putting some things into play and preparing to, if you're stressed about money and budgeting and you listen to a bunch of podcasts or read some books about budgeting, cool. Now you need to actually go create a budget, right? That's the next step of preparation.
The last thing you can do to help with anxiety is to tap into community, both as a resource for sharing your feelings and finding out that you're not alone, but also for the other two. You can learn from community. You can help prepare with community. But people will make this process better for you. And I think that is one of the great benefits of this podcast, as we are finding, is that we are able to help people deal with very stressful stuff.
Yeah. And look, if you're listening to this podcast, which you are, FYI, in case you're confused about what's happening right now, you already have a community. You have Mike and I, you have the other people that listen to Friends on Fire. It takes 30 seconds to go on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, anywhere and find a community around personal finance topics, Facebook, TikTok, any platform you're potentially on, you can find a great community on. If you want in-person community, you can find meetup groups. There's a lot of FI meetup groups around, FI and FIRE meetup groups around Atlanta. You can find people online overnight. You can, again, there's something for everyone depending on what you're interested in and what you want. And I have a great example of the power of community, Mike, that I haven't even told you yet. So I'm a member of the Camp FI alumni group in Facebook because Greg and I went to Camp FI this year, which we really enjoyed. And I've been having I've talked about it on the podcast a little bit. We're doing fine in retirement, but we're going through these untethered feelings. We talked about it in one of the check-in episodes you did, Mike, where we're feeling a little unstructured and untethered. And it's an awkward feeling when you go from having your goals set for you and incredibly busy day where you're in meetings all day long and just everything, the hustle and bustle of kind of how your life is versus this overnight shift we've gone to. And it comes with a lot of feelings, and I can't even put my finger on what some of the feelings are, quite honestly. But a couple weeks ago, I was like, you know what? I should go put a post in one of the FIRE Facebook groups that I'm a member of. And so I chose to do Camp FI because there's a number of people in that group that I know are retired. And I just I wrote a very vulnerable post about some of the meh feelings I'm having, and just that it's taken, I knew everybody we've ever talked to, especially even on this podcast, has said it takes a year to get into where your groove and where you're feeling really good, in an early retirement setup, because it's such a huge life transition. I put a post out Friday morning. I got so many amazing and thoughtful and incredibly helpful responses, to the point where I actually kind of want to turn it into a show because it's such great advice. And it was incredibly helpful. I was reading it aloud to Greg over the weekend, and it was just really helpful. And that is the power of community.
That's cool.
And it was better than if I went to my therapist or something who doesn't really understand FIRE. You know what I mean? There's only so much I could get. They're just going to give me a lot of generic, answers to my feelings. And so I just loved it. And I was like, this is the power of community, and I need to tap into it more often. I myself even don't tap into it as often as I could. So, okay. So remember, education, preparation, community.
So let's run through some of the feedback we received from the Instagram poll that you took.
Yeah.
Not poll. What's the word for it?
Question. So
Questionnaire?
it's literally called a question.
Okay. Instagram
That's
question.
the widget is question.
And then we'll share our thoughts. So the first category is spending money and budgeting. Okay, so let's read through a few of these. Even with a budget, spending money on myself and clothes/hair, etc. Knowing when it's okay to spend money versus save, invest. One person just wrote spending it. I love that. Getting over budget, close to going over budget. This one I like, vacation spending. Always blows the budget and is hard to predict in a new place. And then lastly, spending money on myself. $150 starts to make me feel anxious. So I really like those, and I think those are very common.
This is the same thing I mentioned. I'm having anxiety about I know I have a certain amount of money I can spend, but I'm still having anxiety around spending it.
I get a little anxious when you spend a lot of money on splurgy stuff too.
Yeah.
When you bought that $4,000 treadmill, my first reaction was I turned to Britta and I was like, does she even know what FIRE is?
Yeah. That happens every other month. I'm I thought you were going to say my $4,000 TMJ
No.
Therapy, which also has gone swimmingly, as lovely as the treadmill.
So I think my first thought about spending money in general is the best way to reduce anxiety is to identify your core values or priorities. And we've talked about this pretty frequently on the show. I wrote a whole section about it in my book. And it's basically like pick the 3 to 5 things that are the most important to you in life. It could be travel, it could be your hobby, it could be eating healthy or continued education or whatever it is, whatever is the most important to you. And those are the things that you should be spending your money on. Now, having a priority is not enough to reduce anxiety when you are spending money, because you still need to then do your best to save money. You can't say travel is the most important and then go spend $10,000 on each airplane ticket to go fly business class every time, because you're still going to like blow through all of your money. You need to find a good balance of finding good deals and being smart with your money, but then don't feel bad about it. And I think if you are able to identify what's important and align your spending with that, your anxiety about money is going to be reduced dramatically.
Yeah, I agree. The only thing I would just double click on is just knowing your numbers, right? And so like that's all about knowing your priorities and values. And then when you're really confident in your numbers, and you like one person who said even with a budget, just they feel anxious spending money on themselves. But like know where you're at financially, know your net worth, track this stuff, know your budget, and we've got detailed shows on all of these topics. And then do stuff like that C-Fire Sim tool, different projections where you actually see like even with all these fluctuations in the market and inflation getting worse and the market going down, all these other things, like knowing that you'll still be okay, hopefully will make you feel less anxious about spending money. And look, I think there's a fine balance too. Like I think some people need to feel a little bit more anxious about spending money. Not that I want anyone to feel anxiety, but you know what I mean? Like it should be thoughtful, to your point earlier, Mike. And so I don't want you to so flippantly spend money that you don't even think about what you're doing and you're getting into debt and you're not even enjoying your life. But I also think you can get to the point where it's a healthy amount of anxiety where you're being thoughtful about it, which is why you might worry about it a little bit, but you're still giving yourself permission because you know your numbers so well and you're confident. Okay. Another big category was, I kind of summed it up as like, quote, having enough, and also specifically having enough for retirement. And so, some of the comments we got from people were like, the systems I'm using to save money for retirement now in my 20s could be totally different decades from now. Paying for college, balancing retirement, saving with living a good life now, big purchases, a lot of different things summed up there. Not having enough, the terms not having enough were used multiple times. Not having enough for surprise expenses and having to ask somebody for help. It's interesting. I think the answers to all of these to some extent become similar in the sense of like knowing your numbers, planning, like educating, just that education, preparation, community piece, even to come back to. I was trying to think if there's a good acronym there, but it's just EPC, not very exciting.
But this one is actually quite difficult, honestly. Like knowing how much money you need for the rest of your life is a really challenging question. And we're going to put in the show notes like a whole mess of episodes that you guys can listen to. So definitely check that out. But one that comes to mind is episode 112, How to Know If You Are FI. And we talk through kind of the logical progression of how you take your net worth and you divide your living expenses by that to give yourself a sense of how close you are. And then once you realize you're close, what do you need to do to feel comfortable? And what do you need to do to feel safe? And so, Maggie, to your point that you've been repeating, know your numbers, know your net worth, and then continue to pad that until like over time, you will find a point at which you are comfortable. I can't speak for everybody, obviously, but I think that if you go through this progression, you will find a point where you feel comfortable with how much you have because you understand your spending and your net worth and your safety net very well.
And your risk tolerance too, right? I've shared very openly, I think in episode 138, I broke down at a high level how my family of 5 can afford to retire at the age of 41 and 43, myself and my husband. And, we talk about like how we looked at that math of like, the 4% rule, the 25 times your annual cost of living. Like that doesn't feel, that's a little conservative for me, right? I want to plan for all these additional, all the like what ifs that do stress me out. And like, well, what if I, will I have enough for this? Well, what if I have to buy a Tesla? I think that was my example.
Yeah.
And so I think it's okay to say like, I'm going to make my own rule, right? I'm not going to do the 4% rule. There's people who do the 3% rule, which is it's the math of a 3% withdrawal rate, which I don't know the exact number, but it's not 25 times your salary. It's maybe 30, whatever the math is. But, and so know that you can create your own rule that you feel comfortable with based on your risk tolerance and your overall gut of what makes sense for you. And you want to take into account stuff like, am I going to end up needing to help my parents someday? Or is it going to be more likely that I'm actually going to get an inheritance from them? And like, you don't want to count on anything, but all those things should play into the level of kind of how conservative you are in the math you do and your risk tolerance of kind of how you're preparing for the future. But on all these things, like it's a math game, right? Mm-hmm. It's a math equation. It's not a game, but
I think it's kind of a game.
Yes.
All right. Next category, relationships and family.
Yeah. This is a tricky one.
Some responses we got. Finances when married. Did a fun episode about that, I remember. When one partner makes more than the other. And whether my parents have prepared enough for retirement.
It's a big one. We got a number of comments about parents lately.
Yeah, this is one where I just like, I simply cannot relate to these things. I'm very...
Because you and Britta are so on the same page.
I'm so fortunate. Britta and I share almost all of our financial values. Obviously, my parents and I share all the same financial values. We've had my dad on the show a couple times. And so like the conflict between family members or, misunderstandings or misalignment, it has not occurred in my life. I'm very fortunate that way, but I will hand it over to you.
Well, it's funny. I'm also very fortunate. Greg and I are very aligned, especially considering we met later in life. And when I first met Greg, I had no idea that I wanted to retire early. I mean, I knew I was like good with my money, but I hadn't met you yet, Mike. I hadn't like started this whole, FIRE journey. And so I'm very fortunate that Greg and I happen to be very like-minded in that category. And we've evolved and kind of grown our financial goals together. But we've talked pretty openly. Greg and I have separate finances. We did a whole episode, one of our earlier episodes, episode 34, on the pros and cons of split versus combined finances. And the net of that in the end, for what it's worth, is it doesn't matter what you do as long as you have strong communication with your partner, right? Like, don't stress over which way you do it. Like a lot of things, like I don't care exactly how you want to do your net worth tracking. Just do net worth tracking. Write it down somewhere, right? And so I think it's less on the exact specifics of the how and more that you are communicating openly with your partner and spouse. And we did another episode 109 on talking to your partner about money. Is one of the most critical things that is important for a healthy relationship is that you can have open, honest, vulnerable discussions about your finances, even if you don't always agree, but that you can talk respectfully and, try to go on this journey together. But, some of the specific things people shared here of like when one partner makes more than the other, I know there's some anxiety that comes in that. But again, that's a communication piece, right? That's talking through how it makes you feel. It's normal that there's different feelings that could come up from either end of, who's making more or who's making less. And then how the money's getting spent related to that, right? I've talked to someone before where I know they make a lot more money than their spouse. In this case, it's a woman who's making a lot more than her husband. And I remember her telling me like, he's the one that spends all the money and she's the one that's being all responsible with the money. And I'm like, look, you have a right to like, I put your foot down might be the wrong term, but I was like, regardless of the scenario, like you especially have a right when you're earning a lot more than the other person and they're the ones that like, are willy-nilly spending money and not having any kind of, focus towards the future. You definitely have a right to like bring that up. You should be talking about this stuff. If not, you're burying it. It creates resentment. It creates a bunch of other issues in a marriage. And it's just so important to have those discussions. I'll kind of just leave it at that in the sense of like, if that is an issue you have with your partner, I definitely suggest it's something that you address and dig into because it is just so important to have open, respectful, vulnerable discussions about finances with your partner, even if you aren't always aligned on everything 100%. And I just would encourage that to be an investment you put into your relationship, whether that means you guys, go see a financial coach, a financial therapist, a regular therapist, whatever, just listening to podcasts, reading a financial book together. We have a lot of ideas that we put in that episode 109 about talking to your partner about money. And then the last thing that a number of people mentioned too, Mike, was whether or not their parents have prepared enough for retirement. We were just talking about this with Liz. Actually, that episode won't have aired yet, but another really common anxiety we got was the whether my parents had prepared enough for retirement. And this is a topic I really want to do a focused episode on, but just like you need to have spouses with your just like you need to have conversations with your partner about money, you need to have conversations with your parents too, right? Especially if they're in any way expecting that you're going to need to help out in their older age financially and, time wise, which most kids will need to in some way. It's totally fair game for you to be like, hey, let's talk about your finances. Is everything good? Do you how have you prepared? Are you going to be okay if you need, assisted living? What does this look like? Is your money invested well? I think there's a point where when you become an older adult, it's totally appropriate to respectfully bring that up with your parents. And, everybody knows the relationship they have with their parents, so it could be different, but I have very open discussions. I didn't when I was a kid, but I do now with my mom about money. And I know she knows that, myself and my brother are going to be the ones that are helping her out, not necessarily even financially, but just logistically now and as she gets older. And so she's invested in wanting to make sure that we're all clear on what the situation is, right? And what she has and what she doesn't, what she might need and what she doesn't. So anyways, I think we should do a whole episode on that because there's so much that we could all do to help our parents and to broach those topics with our parents. Okay, what's next?
Next category, houses. Some responses we got. Large home expenses and repairs. Buying a house. Yeah, I get that one. Having mortgage debt. Knowing I have the cash to pay it off now, but not the balls to do it. I like that response. Mm-hmm. Not sure it takes balls paying off your... We should dig into that one a little bit.
I think it does. That's why we did a whole episode on it.
Purchasing a new home to be built and selling current home. I think these are all very valid concerns, and everybody should be very anxious about spending that much money on a house. And I would suggest a couple things. First is you should compartmentalize your decisions when it comes to home repairs and purchases. And so if you go spend $100 at a grocery store, that's a lot of money. If you spend $100 buying a house, that's nothing. You shouldn't be dismissive of that $100 in the house, but you shouldn't you need to make the good larger decision and then just let the pieces fall where they may. And I think that's going to help people avoid some of the anxiety that comes with a big purchase. Know you're making the right overall decision, then don't worry too much about all the details.
Mike, you are very good at that in terms of as financially detail oriented of a person as you are. You don't really sweat the small stuff. You kind of worry about the big stuff, and you don't micromanage some of the smaller stuff. And I tend to, sometimes I'll get so bent out of shape about little stuff that I'm not I just kind of miss the big I buy a $4,000 treadmill, which I actually love, by the way. But
yeah, actually, that's a good point. One of the things you and I were discussing ETFs to buy, and you were very concerned about the fees. I think just the principle of paying fees. And higher you were fees, I wanted to buy this zero fee fund versus one that I recommended. And I was like, well, what's the fee? And you were like 0.04%. And I'm like, yeah, but that's nothing, Yeah. And so these at least are the principle of it. You are exactly right. You should absolutely try to find the lowest cost fees. But from my perspective, if I find something that's performing well that I believe in, 0.04%, not 4% or 0.4%, 0.04% is just an immaterial amount of money. Now, I wouldn't want to make a decision based on that. I would make it on other characteristics.
Yeah. It's a loaf of sour bread.
Yeah, that's right.
Which I'm not even allowing myself to have right now. Okay.
The other thing I'll say about houses is that, we've talked about just the cost of owning a home. Like, these are not the big money makers that mortgage companies and real estate agents want you to believe. So like buying and selling homes, not going to make you a lot of money, hugely expensive. And so, make sure you're doing it for the right lifestyle reasons. Make sure it's going to make you happy, and then try to do it as cost effectively as possible. But these are not investment decisions, your primary home at least. You shouldn't view them that way, in my opinion.
Yeah, Mike, I forgot we did those 2 episodes, episode 87 and episode 88, which were on, hey, renters, should you buy a house? And then tactical advice for buying a house. And you're right. I often even forget it. But one of the big themes in that first episode was not everyone needs to own a home. It's a lifestyle decision. I think everyone gets so caught up on the idea that like success in life is owning a piece of property. There's a lot of people that, given how often they move, or a bunch of different, if they're in a high cost of living area, et cetera, it just doesn't make sense to own a home financially. And you're actually better off renting in many cases. And so I think there's just a lot around get in the mindset that like when you own a home, you're making a lifestyle decision. It will come with expenses and repairs. Like best case, you're going to have, smaller amounts of it, but every home requires maintenance, even the newest of homes. Like accidents happen, things need to be maintained. And I think that's a big piece of like, we talked about just education, preparation, community. In the preparation category, I would put just so much around like your mindset, right? And when you expect things to come in, like when you have a home, a sinking fund or whatever, an emergency fund, whatever you want to call it, for home repairs and for home maintenance, then you're prepared for it. So you prepared for it, and your mindset should be different when those things come up, because you're like, okay, cool. I'm less anxious about this because I have prepared for the fact I've educated myself on the fact that I know I need, house emergency fund, and I prepared for it by actually saving for it. So I am no longer anxious about these things. And if I can't afford to do that, then maybe I'm not going to buy a home yet.
All right. Next category, my favorite. Investing, stock market volatility, inflation, recessions. This is my wheelhouse.
This is like the biggest category of anxieties we got right now.
All right. Why don't you read through them and I will provide some thoughts.
Because these like all come out of my head in some way, though they did come from listeners.
I am prepared to answer them because you and I discuss them all the time.
The chance I will lose it all in the stock market, whether or not we're in a recession, and seeing people spend like there isn't inflation. I like that. They're like anxious about other people's spending. Not having started investing until late 30s. I can relate. Stock market volatility and having enough to retire, recession, possible future scenario and wanting to retire while the market's down. Not earning anything in the market for the next 25 years. That's depressing. Let's not have that be real. Cutting back on work to enjoy time with family, but inflation. Losing huge amounts of money because of putting too many eggs in one basket. So those are just some of the examples of the types of financial anxieties that people have. I also think, Mike, for me, but tied to the kind of community piece, it's helpful to, it's not like misery loves company, but it is helpful to see that we all have similar anxieties, right? Like I feel less whatever about my anxiety about the stock market when I see like lots of people have anxiety about the stock market. Like that's a normal feeling, and let me like name it and accept it and, do what I can. So what can I do with that?
When it comes to investments, I think there's 2 big categories of things that you can do. The first, and Maggie, it's a message that you like to repeat quite often, is that like saving money and investing for the long term, these are all just things you should go do. Don't worry if it's a Roth IRA or a 401k. Like don't get so hung up on these little details. If you are saving your money, if you're putting it in the stock market, if you're paying down debt, these are all great things. You shouldn't lose sleep over it. You should just pick one and go do it. Now, when it comes to investing, though, I think that talking yourself through the scenarios is going to be the most effective way to deal with this. And Maggie, I think one of the things that you notice about me, much to your displeasure, is that I react very quickly and I can be kind of dismissive of things that are very concerning to you. And the reason that is, you didn't even acknowledge it. You're just like, yeah.
No, I was maybe. I mean, maybe once or twice. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
And the reason that is because I spend a lot of time thinking about these things anyway. So when you raise questions to me about something, it is something I am already very familiar with. But I also think through and have kind of developed the skill of thinking through scenarios very quickly. I think it's something that's helped me be very good at my job. And so what I like to do, and this is kind of a common way to deal with all kinds of anxieties, not just money. Think about the scenarios that can occur. What is the absolute worst case scenario? Then what would be a bad scenario? And then what would be a bad scenario that's likely to happen? What would be bad that's unlikely to happen? And what would be your best case? And so when you ask me investment questions, or anybody asks me investment questions, I'm like, oh, just put it on this. And it's because I am already watching the markets. I already have a sense of like where we're at. But I also understand like the worst case scenario is if you move all your money into a broad-based index fund, even if it's one that's specific to like high growth, which I like. Worst case scenario, absolute worst case scenario, you lose 50% of your money and then it takes you 5 years to recover. The absolute worst case, which you could live with. The likely scenario, bad scenario, is that you mistime it and it drops 5%. Not a big deal. You could also lose 10% in a correction. But in all likelihood, you're just going to hit some normal timing and you're going to make 15% a year for the rest of your life. And that is likely what's going to happen.
So a couple of thoughts back.
Okay.
One, the person who said, is related to what you were just saying, but the person who said not earning anything in the market for the next 25 years, that's like a worst case scenario, right? That's worse than anything you just said. But what I would say to that is if that actually becomes a reality, there's like a massive collapse of the financial markets in the around the globally, like the global economy, something crazy has happened, like apocalyptic has happened.
We got bigger problems.
COVID, we had a global pandemic and it went down and came right back up. So, I mean, that is really like when you go to worst case, like sometimes when I really like let myself go to worst case thinking and I'm like, oh, what if the stock market like never recovers? We got way bigger problems in this world at that point than my portfolio. And so I try to remind myself of that, which I don't know if that, going down that worst case rabbit hole helps everyone, but it does help me. And then the other thing that I just want to kind of add on to what you were saying, Mike, is one of the things you were saying that kind of is rooted in your confidence around the market and just the economy bouncing back and just a number of things is your level of experience in investing, right? And you've been in the market for 20 years. So you've felt the ups and downs and you know when it goes down, it comes back up and you've seen it and you have a level of confidence and trust. Is that fair to say?
Yes, absolutely.
Just based on your level of experience with it. Now, I didn't always have that feeling, right? I did not start investing until I was 36 years old, which was 7 years ago or 6 or 7 years ago. And I've made up for a lot of ground in that time. And I've, invested very aggressively in that time, but I have way less experience even under my belt, but I already just in the overall, when I take a step back and I look at the earnings I've had over the last 6 to 7 years, I don't get so bent out of shape about even the decline now. I'm like, cool, I'm going to buy a bunch of stuff on sale right now. And so my point is just, the more you just got to get in and you got to have experience under your belt. And some of the anxiety will go away with that experience of you seeing that longer term performance, of you going through the declines we saw during COVID even, and then seeing it go right back up, right? Twofold. And so I think you've had 20 plus years experience. I've had 6 to 7, but I already feel so much more confident just in my 6 to 7 years. And now when people ask me for advice, I feel very confident saying what to buy and that I feel good about it long term. I'm not saying you're going to make a big return in the next 6 months, but when you don't need the money for a few years, which is the spirit of the money that we're investing here, unless it was an emergency, I feel really good about it. And I'm not super stressed about it.
I'm glad to hear it.
I've come a lot. That's coming a long way for me, from my bag lady syndrome.
Yeah. It reminds me of when we first discussed the deferred compensation, and you're like, "How much should I defer?"
So nervous.
And I'm like, "All of it." And you're like 5%? Like, no, All of it.
All of the max. 70, was it 75%?
Yeah,
is the max?
75%.
Yeah. It was, and then COVID hit. That remember we talked about that on the show. That I was like, when I finally got comfortable, and I was like, what's the worst that could happen? And then I was like, holy
Pandemic.
crap! I didn't know the bottom could fall out of the travel industry. But still, even with that being in one of the worst industries during COVID, it still bounced back.
Yeah.
The company, everything, right? And so. I think you going through some of those like tough times just gives you the confidence and the positivity and the optimism for the future. Also back to the like education preparation, like look at the historical market returns over the past 50 to 60 years. Like that is actual like real data that should inform you and make you feel comfortable. It's the same way when you get nervous about flying on a plane and you remind yourself that you have a higher likelihood of getting in a car wreck than you do of getting injured on a plane in some way.
One more thing to make people feel a little more confident in the stock market is that there are all real companies underlying these stocks. And those companies have real estate and they have other physical assets. They develop products. They have patents. They have people. There is stuff there that is worth money. So even if you don't understand exactly how the stock market works, investing in a company like Amazon or Apple or Microsoft, there is value there. It can only decline so far. This is different than a Bitcoin where
I was just going to use that example where there's like vaporware.
There's
nothing there
other than people's belief in it. But the stock market will never go to zero. It's not a fad. And so the worst case scenario is that you have a huge recession and everything drops 50%.
Yeah,
but then
multi-year.
Yeah. All right. One more category, Maggie, and I think it's not really finance, but it's definitely financial related and super stressful for people. So I think it's important that we're going to do it last.
It's health insurance and medical costs.
So some responses. One person just wrote medical. Totally get it.
Short and sweet.
Medical issues. What if I get so sick I can't work and lose my income and insurance and I have long-term disability?
I like that they were saying their point was they have long-term disability and they're still anxious about that.
Not having enough dollars or getting sick and having crazy hospital bills and going broke, major medical bills, ongoing cost of health insurance, healthcare. Our system in the US is broken, so expensive, it's so confusing. All very valid. Our system here is a total mess. For anybody who's spent some time overseas and either experienced the medical systems over there or has family or friends who live in different countries where there's socialized medicine, you know that the US is a total disaster. We have great service at the very top. The most expensive service is outstanding. It's the best in the world. But overall, it is a shitty system.
But that being said, if you choose to live in the US, this is the system we have. Mm-hmm. So you got to play the game, right? Don't hate the player, hate the game. Wait,
you just contradicted yourself. You just play the game. Let's keep it at that.
All right, just play the game. And by playing the game, I mean, you got to make the best with what you have, right? So I'm paying, if you take Greg and me right now, we are paying $1,300 a month for medical insurance temporarily because we're on COBRA, or it would have been about the same on the ACA because we don't qualify for any subsidies. We will next year. And it's part of the thing. I budgeted for it. I planned for it. And to everybody who put the sort of, what if I get sick? I lose my income. I lose my, whatever. We still have the Affordable Care Act. Mm-hmm. We hopefully will continue to have it. You always will have a right to be insured and to buy insurance. It's going to be expensive and it may not be of the quality we want, but it is good enough to cover those emergencies. And so that's what I have insurance. This is the only reason I have insurance is for those emergencies, for the, I end up in a crazy ER bill, an accident. I end up getting cancer and have hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical care needed. That's what your insurance is for. That's when it will kick in. I mean, even on a high deductible plan, like 20, 30 grand sometimes. But after that, is when almost everything's covered or a big percentage of things are covered. So I would just remind you that is why we have medical insurance. And yes, it is expensive. If you are lower income though, which is when you can't afford it, there are subsidies and there are other, programs in place to help provide that insurance at a better rate depending on what your financial situation is. And then if you make a lot of money, yeah, you may end up paying, like we are right now, $1,300 a month for 2 people to have medical insurance. But that's the cost of me being protected if something catastrophic happens.
And let's also talk through some of the scenarios. Like if Maggie, you and Greg, for some reason get kicked off your insurance, or you can't buy it anymore, or it's outrageously expensive. Worst case scenario, you could go, one of you goes back to work and gets insurance.
Yeah.
Total worst case scenario, you are both stricken with some debilitating illness. You can't go back to work, and I drive you down to Mexico or Panama, and you relocate there while you get some free service.
You joke, but yes, geo arbitrage. I go to another. You're serious. Yeah. Well, thank you for offering to drive us.
Yes, I would. It would be a nice vacation for me. But this is one of the things like I talked to my dad about, because he likes to kind of raise concerns about what I do in the future, and I'd be like, listen, if all goes to hell, moving to Germany with my family.
Yeah, isn't it? People call it medical tourism. It's even if you don't want to move, you just go overseas to get whatever thing you need.
Yeah.
At some pretty good quality medical care and way different pricing than is in the US.
Yeah. If I had some voluntary surgery I needed, it was going to cost me $20,000 here and $1,000 over in Germany. I had to go fly to Germany and go do it.
Yeah. And you're right. This is one of the ones where you're like, go to the worst case scenario and then work your way back towards, the kind of middle case and the best case and all that. But you're right. The worst case scenario is what I've told myself many times, which is I could go become a teacher. I could go work at Starbucks. There's a number of things I could do to have employee sponsored health insurance, again, that would not be difficult jobs for us to get. But also, we will have a significant amount of notice in this country if something changes with the Affordable Care Act, if something changes with, the current option. And then we'll take that time to figure out our next best path, right? And I think that's just back to the education preparation community. The FI community is incredibly helpful if you want to talk about medical insurance options and how to get the best deals through the ACA marketplace and things like that. And so again, we've done a couple of shows on this. Episode 139, we go into detail about our medical insurance approach in early retirement. And we've done a few others on just, creative ways to save on medical expenses. But it's like all of these anxieties, you just got to educate yourself, figure out your own specific plan, and tap into your community as best you can for advice and wisdom. And sometimes just commiserating about, yes, it's expensive. Let's kind of move on and get past that and just figure out what our best approach is and what we're going to do about it.
All right, Maggie, should we hit our top 3 takeaways?
I think so.
All right. Takeaway number 1, financial anxieties are a real thing. We all have them to some extent or another. Even
Mike. Even Mike. Number 2, there are things you can do to cope with and manage these anxieties proactively. We hope we've given you some, thought starters during this episode and pointed you to some other episodes to dig into more detail.
Number 3, appreciate how far you've come already. Just for listening to this podcast, seriously, and any other research that you are doing, you are already making forward progress, and you can continue moving forward thoughtfully on your financial journey.
Cool. Well, Mike, I hope this episode has been helpful to everyone who shared their financial anxieties with us and just everyone who has financial anxiety, because like we said, it's normal. We've all got them. It's one of the many reasons we enjoy doing this podcast, because we believe that talking about money with your friends and family improves everybody's lives. And so again, like Mike said, just you listening to this podcast means you're on the right journey and you're doing some of the things that you need to be doing. So kudos to you. Thank you for listening. If you've been challenged or inspired by what you've heard today, please rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. We always appreciate that.
You can also subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. If you have any thoughts or questions, we'd love to hear from you. And you can leave us a voicemail or text us at 404-981-3370 or hit us up on Instagram.
Cool. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Maggie.
Bye.
Bye.